vindicated. And that element, that core rationale for the Australian plan, as I described it at the outset, giving a role to the UN which would give the Chinese a face-saving reason to withdraw from supporting the Khmer Rouge, that would result eventually, if not immediately, in the Khmer Rouge withering away. That's the bit of this whole thing that I think we did get absolutely right. And I think one of the best bits of evidence in the last 2 or 3 years that the wheel has turned is that Cambodia itself is now making a significant contribution to UN peacekeeping in various parts of the world. So from receiving blue berets to stabilise the country, to sending blue berets to stabilise other countries, is really a pretty big circle to turn. I think it's also true to say that this peace has made possible the gradual revival of confidence in the economy, to the extent that Cambodia is now one of the success stories of the region. I visited Phnom Penh a couple of years ago after a very long time away, and I have to say that I really could sense the spirit of confidence and vitality that was in the air. The city looked and felt very different and much more vibrant than the city struggling to find its feet that I knew well a couple of decades ago. But having said everything I possibly can say on the positive side of the ledger, I have to conclude by saying that obviously when you look at Cambodia now, the glass is still only at best half full. In democracy and human rights terms, Cambodia still has a very long way to go before it can stand proudly in the ranks of those nations who can credibly claim to fully respect both. So I think it really is crucial for this reason for civil society activists in Cambodia to maintain their commitment to effective change, crucial for academic analysts to continue to draw closely researched attention to what continues to go wrong in the country, critical for the rest of the world to give those who are campaigning for human rights and democracy in all sorts of ways strong support for their commitment and courage. Crucial that the spotlight of close and informed scrutiny continue to shine on the state and its leadership. So conferences like this, I think, are very important in keeping all that going. And with all that, I'll throw it open to you for questions and discussion. Thank you. I can half recognise a number of people. Would you mind identifying yourself?
I'm sorry, my name's Damien Cobham. I'm from Adelaide.
Yeah, good.
This morning, Ambassador Surat was talking about ASEAN and the South China Sea, and I was asking him the question which I would like to ask you again. Do you think there's a role for someone like Australia or somebody else to play the sort of role, the citizenship role with ASEAN 20 years later, or is it a totally different game?
I think it probably is a totally different game. It was very disappointing, I have to say, the role that Cambodia played at that ASEAN meeting, and so obviously being under the thumb of Beijing and in holding out against a consensus statement of a fairly modest kind for the first time in ASEAN's history. But I won't belabor the point because we all know the acute discomfort that Phnom Penh was feeling under that pressure. I think, what we've got in the South China Sea at the moment is a China which is really overreaching itself with a great bout of nationalist chest beating and the promulgation of claims, territorial claims, which simply, the way they're being formulated at the moment, don't bear any rational scrutiny at all. They're still talking in terms of the 9-dashed line, something that Taiwan actually originated not so many decades ago. Doesn't even describe with precision what their claim is within those 9 dashes, and it doesn't begin to articulate the case in terms of the criteria that are set out in the Law of the Sea Convention, to which China is a party, which does enable you to take account not just of 1,000-mile economic zones from your actual physical boundaries of the mainland, but also to take into account what might prove to be legitimate claims of sovereign entitlement to offshore islands some distance from the mainland. And China does have a not unreasonable and not implausible claim to a couple of sets of island features in the South China Sea, but none of that is being articulated in that way. If it was articulated in that way, I think you could then have a situation where Vietnam would be articulating its claims in similarly precise terms, the Philippines would be articulating its claims in similarly precise terms, and these are the three key players at the moment. Brunei and so on have all got small claims, but these are the ones that really matter and where all the angst is being concentrated at the moment. I think if you did have China being willing to articulate its claims on a properly founded legal basis with credible evidence in support, you could then either have those claims being adjudicated by the International Court of Justice, which would be the ideal solution, but if key players are not prepared to take the risk of an adverse verdict in that respect, the other thing that can flow from that is you at least then have the foundation to have a rational negotiation, either multilateral or multiple bilateral negotiations on resource sharing arrangements. While not resolving the boundary finally, you say, okay, we've got a contested claim of some credibility based on the Law of the Sea Convention. This overlaps here, that overlaps here. When it comes to oil and gas and things of that kind, we can at least agree to disagree about where the boundaries should be and get on with the business of jointly exploring. That's what China is saying that it's prepared to do. But it's saying that in the context of this terribly vague thing which extends over the whole region and which has led a lot of people to believe that it's simply not serious. I think the pressure has to be on the parties, and of course the Vietnamese and the Filipinos are not without a bit of nationalistic chest beating of their own, and they're contributing to the rather heightened tensions which have been building up. I think it is a matter of defusing this. I don't think there's any sophisticated diplomacy or any big new idea which can be inserted into the process which would change the dynamic in the way that we managed to do with the original peace plan. I think this is just a classic international problem to be solved by classic international diplomacy and, with leverage and pressure by all means being applied, but, that's the way it's got to go. I'm a bit more optimistic than a lot of people that the situation will calm down a bit once the Chinese leadership transition period is over. At the moment, what we're seeing is an awful lot of nationalistic chest beating by officials of all kinds who simply don't want to expose themselves in this incredibly uncertain leadership transition period to any suggestion that they're other than full-throated Chinese nationalists who can be relied upon to defend Chinese interests. And when you scratch academics and people of policy influence in the foreign ministry and in the universities around Beijing and in the the senior advisory councils, there's plenty of moderate Chinese voices in those contexts who are prepared to say this nine-dashed line business is nonsensical, it's just can't expect to be taken seriously by anyone outside China. We're going to have to get our act together and go down the path that I've suggested. And I think there's a reasonably fair chance that if we can just settle things down, get through this transitional period, that kind of judgment will prevail. But part of the problem also in China, and my international crisis group has written, I say, is no longer mine. I've been out of it for 3 years. But the organisation produced an excellent report a few months ago which described the internal dynamics in China, partly in terms of this political transition thing that I've just been mentioning, but partly also in terms of the number of different interests. I mean, the notion that China is a monolithic decision maker in these situations is about as nonsensical as the assumption of monolithical decision making in the US or anywhere else. There's an awful lot of play that goes on between different participants, and the players in the Chinese game at the moment, the foreign ministry is by no means the central one. It's very often marginalised on this, even though that's where most of the sensible moderate voices are concentrated. You've got the resource companies, the state-owned companies with interests of their own that they want to protect. You've got the PLA with a bit of anxiety about protecting sea lanes and all the traditional things that militaries get excited about. You've got maritime agencies for surveillance and protection, border protection, customs type things. We've got interests of their own in having a presence and an extended jurisdiction in those particular waters. And you've got the maritime provinces of China, the southern provinces, which border the South China Sea. And they're a bit of a law unto themselves in terms of the way in which they've been doing their own chest beating and promulgation of really unsubstantiable Chinese, indefensible Chinese claims. So it is a very messy situation, and in the environment where we're lacking strong leadership in the context of the transition, all of these dynamics can have their full voice, and it sounds, and everybody's sort of competing with each other to be more stridently nationalist than everybody else. So, be careful of the situation, but understand the dynamic and work within traditional diplomatic and political channels to try and produce a solution which will ultimately be a bit more rational. Yeah, okay.
Justin Corcoran from Geelong Grammar School. On a totally different note, and what were your experiences in Cambodia in 1968? What things do you remember the most from that time there?
I've written about this quite often. I mean, it was basically I was just doing the student backpack thing, going from Australia to Oxford, take up a scholarship and visiting 30 countries on the way, and taking 9 months to do it by plane hopping, actually more than overland, and cardboard suitcase actually rather than backpack in those days, but same thing. My experience in Cambodia was just fantastic. I mean, exactly what I'd done in Indonesia and Nepal and India and Afghanistan and all over the region. Spent a lot of time in student hangouts, bars, noodle shops, campuses, going up to Siem Reap on that then very dusty road in a share taxi with a group of other students, scattering dogs and chickens and children along the way. And I was only there a week or so, but I did meet a number of people, and as I met them everywhere else, and it was just one of those formative, wonderful experiences that gave you a sense of just the vibrancy of the country and everything else. But the big difference in subsequent years, I mean, in all the other countries I visited on that trip, I met over and over again in various guises, various contexts, either particular young people that I'd actually met at the time, or people exactly like them, of that generation, with that sort of bundle of shared experiences which we could reminisce about. I mean, in some cases it was the actual individuals. I mean, for example, in Indonesia, I was bumming around one day on the Bandung campus up in central Java, got into conversation with an Indonesian guy. He said, we've got an English class coming along in a few minutes with some crazed American missionary coming to talk English to us. Why don't you join him? And I went along to the class, got into an extensive argument with the crazed missionary in question, and obviously created a bit of an impression in the class, which lingered to the point that 25 years later, when I turned up in Indonesia on one ministerial trip as foreign minister, ushered into the presence of the Secretary General of Golkar, a major party. The Secretary General gets up from his desk and looks at me, and I look at him. We both said, Bandung campus, not So, I mean, there were experiences like this, but the difference was, for Cambodia, and I've said this on many public occasions, never again did I meet any of the actual youngsters that I'd met in that visit, or anyone exactly like them of that vintage. Because that whole cohort of university students, people with glasses, purported intellectuals, purported threats to the Khmer regime, were just wiped out, killed directly, executed, murdered, sent to the killing field, died of starvation, died of exhaustion. And, that was really, to me, the most single moving experience in reflection of my Cambodian experience. And it made me say to myself at the time, when all of this exploded, this was all 68, and then 75 it all happened with the Khmer Rouge. And I said to myself at the time, if ever I get the chance to do something that can avoid anything like that happening again, this will be a very high priority for me. And luckily I was able to do a bit, and that's one of the reasons I was so motivated to pick up where Bill Hayden, to be fair, and the Hawke administration